Well, good morning. It's great to be back in Kitchener with you all this morning. As Richard already mentioned earlier, last Friday, a group of us went out to Steinbach for that amazing weekend. Curtis and Sandra shared about that. And I, too, can say that I felt very challenged by that weekend. Challenged in my own personal walk with Jesus Christ, but also in the way that I do ministry. And then on Monday, we went from Steinbach, and we went to Winnipeg, and then flew from Winnipeg to Abbotsford, BC, where it went from freezing cold and snowing to 15 degrees, so that was pretty nice. And then in BC, we went to the MB Study Conference, which was on transforming discipleship. And there again, I was really challenged and encouraged. And while I was at the conference, I actually had the opportunity to be on the listening committee, and I also delivered a workshop on how to have a Christ-centered approach to youth ministry. So Friday came to an end. I took a red-eye flight home Friday to Saturday morning, and then I came in yesterday to Good Kitchener, and I was very happy to be home. Very tired, but happy to be back, and also so thankful for the opportunity that I had to go on those conferences and to learn. And I am excited to see how God works in my life because of it, and then also how God's going to work here at Glencairn in light of those conferences as well. This morning, we are going to be continuing on our series on God's grace, and today we're going to be looking at transforming grace. In doing this, we're going to be looking at Philippians 1:27 to 2:18. I know that's a really big passage, but it covers one big idea. And so if you have your Bibles, I would strongly encourage you to follow through with us this morning. We're going to be sticking really closely to it and seeing what it has to say to us. So the first chunk we're going to look at is Philippians 1:27 to 30. Let's read. Whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then, whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in the one Spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. This is a sign to them that they will be destroyed, but that you will be saved, and that by God. For it has been granted to you, on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him, since you are going through the same struggle you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. Whenever I personally read passages like this, I can sometimes think that it just doesn't have anything to do with me. Right? I hear about the suffering that Christians go through, and I know that I don't face the same kind of suffering that the early church did, or that many Christians across the world today still suffer. And so I can sometimes tend to think that this passage just doesn't apply to me today. But that's not the case. It does have very significant application for us. But in order to see that, we need to actually begin back at the beginning in verse 27. Here, Paul opens the section by calling the church of Philippi to live a life worthy of the gospel. And it's really important for us to remember that when we read letters like this, these were not addressed to individual people. These were written to churches, and so when we read it, we need to think of it in light of how it affects the church as a whole. And so these teachings, we should be listening to them on behalf of Glencairn and for ourselves individually. So as a church, then, we are called to live lives worthy of the gospel. And this is to happen regardless of any circumstances and regardless of what happens. And this might sound like kind of an abstract phrase, but Paul clarifies what it means immediately following this verse. He says that they are to stand firm in one spirit and strive as one for the gospel without being afraid of outside opposition. Paul calls the church of Philippi to have unity in their mission of following and proclaiming Jesus. See, rather than debate about one another or to gossip about one another or to cause division, they are to work together in unity. And then only by having this unity, having this common goal in Jesus Christ, can they then live lives worthy of the gospel. So this is a call for the church to be unified. But we might ask why? Why does it have to be unified? And exactly in verse 28, Paul mentions that it's because people will oppose those who are inside the church. And if there's any opposition from outside of the church, and if there's opposition from within the church, then not only is the church going to be under attack from those outside of it, but it's also going to be under attack from those within it. When I was reflecting on this passage, I was thought back to a basketball game that I was a part of when I was in high school. Now, this memory has been ingrained in my head. I'm sure my parents will remember it as I recall it. But it was in my grade 10 year, and what happened on our basketball team is that we had both a senior guys and a junior guys basketball team. So after school, the game would start, and it would start with the senior boys, and then after the senior boys were done, then the junior boys could play. So the junior boys game didn't usually start until around 4:30. Now, usually, we would just hang out at the school and, get each other psyched up and then go to the game. But one day, me and a couple of my friends and I had the bright idea to go to a friend's house after school and to play there for a bit, and then his dad would give us a ride home. A ride back to school. The problem was, however, the dad did not show up on time. And so when it came time for us to go back to the school, we ended up being quite late for the first quarter. Now, as you could imagine, showing up late to a game that already started, a game that we were now down by quite a bit of points in, losing by a fair amount, the rest of the team was not too happy with us. Rightfully so. And the rest of the game was full of tension between us and our teammates. Later on in that game, we ended up losing. Was it because the team was better than us? I don't think it was. But was it because of that tension that existed inside of our team? Because of that tension, we could not work together. We could not work towards the same goal. And so, let alone the fact that a team was trying to beat us, we were trying to beat each other as well. And in many ways, I think that the church is really no different. See, if the church inside is full of quarrels and full of gossip and full of hatred towards one another, then it's of little doubt that when outside opposition comes our way, we will not be able to stand against it. So that's why Paul calls the church to be unified, to trust in the Spirit and to follow after Christ together. And then that way, when people attack us, and when people try to stop the mission of the church by slandering it, or what people do today, saying it's ineffective, there's no point in the church, we can be a sign to them that no, really, actually, the gospel does make a difference. Because look at our transformed lives. Look at the way that we get along with one another. Look at how we have so many different demographics, and yet we can all come together under one unified mission. And so we are a sign to those that try to oppose us. So therefore, in verse 29, it says that Christians are not only granted to believe in Christ, but we are to suffer in Christ as well. And that sounds really bizarre, right? It's a gift. It's actually a gift that we get to suffer on behalf of Christ. But when suffering does come, there is support through this unified body. And rather than be destroyed by our suffering, the suffering actually brings us together. It helps us to be unified, and it helps us to look to Jesus as our common goal and our common place of salvation and strength. And so based on this first passage, we can see two main things. First, we see that transformation comes as a part of being in a church body. Okay? That's really important. We cannot go and seek transformation by ourselves without being a part of a church. We need to be part of a church. We need to be part of a body. And the second thing we see is that suffering in opposition actually transforms a unified body. It brings us together, and that suffering can actually be used for good. So that's our first section. This goes now to our second section, which Emily read for us. Thank you, Emily, for doing that. And so now as we look at this, it's important again to remember, so not only was this letter written to a church, but this letter was written as a whole, right? So when they read the letter to the church. They didn't go, okay, we're going to read Philippians 1:1-5 today, and then take a break, right? They didn't have those breaks. They just read it as a full letter. And so there's connections that are going on. And there's a connection between the first part and then this part that we're looking at. So notice in verse 1 how Paul starts by saying, therefore, or so, and then says, if you have any encouragement from what? From being unified with Christ. And so again, this theme of the unity of the body is brought up, and it's showing us that it's a very important part of what's going on here. And the other thing that's really key from this is that the unity does not come from our shared love of food. It doesn't come from our shared love for a certain hobby. It doesn't come from our shared love for a certain type of worship music or a certain type of preaching. But our unity is to come from our shared desire in Jesus Christ and to make him known. And therefore, in verse 3, Paul calls the church to be unified not by having selfish ambition, but to be humble and to value others as above yourself. That those in the church are not to look out for the best of their own interest, but to the interests of others. In North American church, I believe that we have this very, very upside down. And to illustrate this a bit, we're actually going to watch a video by a comedian named John Christ, and it is called Church Hunters Episode 2. Now, of course, this video is very funny, but at the same time, it should also be very alarming for us. These actors go over the top to show the consumerist culture that we live in has influenced the church and our understanding of church. Rather than as a place to go where we can humbly serve others, we go to church as a place that we can be served. We go to church that serves us, our best interests, our wants, and our desires. And ultimately, this is very backwards. Instead, we should be coming to church and thinking, how can I be a blessing to this church? How can I serve this church? Our model for living in this way is set forth by Jesus himself, who, as it says in verse 6, humbled himself and became a servant by dying on the cross. God the Son emptied himself of the glory that he had to be born in a barn, to be fully God, fully man, to live a perfect life, and then to die as a sacrifice for God's people. Similarly, we too are to empty ourselves of what we might have, to empty ourselves of our own selfish desires, to empty ourselves of our own dreams and our ambitions, and instead to look to Christ for the dream and for the calling that he has for us. And so when we come to church, we should not be thinking, how can I get served here? But how can I be like Christ and humbly serve others? For it is by following Christ's example and by giving up our own desires and serving others that we are transformed. However, we know that Christ's life did not end with his death on the cross. In verse 9, it states that Christ was exalted to the highest place and was given the name above every name. See, Jesus has been given all authority so that every knee will one day bow to him and every tongue will acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord. Our country does not currently acknowledge that Jesus is Lord, but we as a church do. And we need to live as though Jesus is Lord of our life. As this passage makes clear, we do this by following after his example, by denying ourselves, and by following him and serving him and others as above ourselves. This brings us to the third and final section in Philippians, which is chapter 2, verses 12 through to 18. Therefore, my dear friends, if you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fill his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation, Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. In light of the example that was set forth by Christ and the authority that has been given in, Paul then calls the church of Philippi to obey, not only when he is there, but in his absence as well. And notice how he does not say obey and then talks about the authority that's been given to Christ. But rather, he first mentions that Christ has authority, and then he calls the church to obey. This reminds me of the Great Commission in Matthew 28:18-20. Here, Jesus calls his disciples to gather together. He then tells them that he has been given all authority on heaven and earth, and then he tells them, in light of that authority, to go and make disciples who obey Christ. In the same way, Paul roots Christian obedience to what Jesus has already done for us. He roots it in Jesus' obedience to his death, and then through his death, the authority that he has been given. Because he's died on a cross for our sins, because he has all authority on heaven and earth, we are to obey Christ. And then Paul makes a very interesting statement. He says, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. This picture beautifully depicts what is often termed the tension between divine sovereignty and human responsibility. See, we are to work out our salvation. Why? Because it is God who works in us. Notice it is not the other way around. It's not work as hard as you can so that God will work in you, but it's because God is already working in you, then you are to work at your salvation. We do not earn our salvation. It is not something that we can obtain, but it is something that God has granted to us. It is a gift. And because God has saved us through his son Jesus, we can then in turn obey him, and we can be transformed to be like him. And so transformation really involves both parties. It involves both God and it involves us. It is impossible to be transformed apart from God's work, and yet he gives us the opportunity to work at our salvation. Dallas Willard sums up this tension really well. He writes, grace is not opposed to effort. It is opposed to earning. Earning is an attitude. Effort is an action. God works in us. He saves us. He forgives us. And in return, we strive after Christ and we seek to be transformed into his likeness. And the last part that Paul addresses here is he asks the question of why we should be transformed. Why should we be a part of a unified body, and why should we selflessly serve others as higher than ourselves? Give some motivation for it. And in verse 15, he gives one part. He says, so that we may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. See, in contrast to a sinful and broken world, we are to be like shining stars. And so, as we are transformed, we are actually to live missional lives. We should go out into the culture, and people should be able to see that there's something different about us. And so this is an important question to ask when we're off at work, when we're off at school. Do people look at us and see that there's something different? Do people see us as in contrast to this warped and crooked generation? Another reason that we are to seek transformation is for Paul's sake. Well, probably not us, but the church of Philippi was to seek transformation for the sake of Paul. So notice what he says at the end of verse 16. And then I will be able to boast in the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. So you see, what Paul is saying is that the church of Philippi should obey Christ and be transformed into his image so that Paul knows that his work was not in vain. That actually sounds like a very interesting thought. Paul labored in the church, and in return, he asked the church to become like Christ. And that was so that Paul knew that what he did actually made a difference. And similarly, I do think that this goes for those who serve in the church today. Leaders in the church desire to see the congregation transformed to become like Christ. And so a way that congregants in a church can show their leaders that they appreciate their work is to actually become more like Christ and to strive after him. And I know this sounds very weird, right? It sounds like a bizarre motivation for us to have, but yet this is a reason that Paul gives. And according to Paul's desires, he clarifies that the leaders in church can see that their work is not in vain when they see that people are actually becoming more like Christ. And then with this, in verse 17, Paul says that even if he is poured out like a drink offering, he is glad and he can rejoice. Even if Paul dies, he can rejoice if he sees transformation happen in the life of his church, in the church. And in the same way, we too can strive after Christ, and we can bring joy to those who have led us and those who have invested in us as they see that transformation is really happening. Now, we covered a whole lot of stuff there, so let's just do a brief recap. So in the first section, in Philippians 1, 27 to 30, we saw that the call to be transformed takes place in a unified church. And that way, the church can face opposition and suffering together as they strive after Christ and look to proclaim his message. In the second section, Philippians 2, 1 to 11, we saw that there is a call for Christians to model after Christ by humbling themselves and putting others higher. This means that we need to give up our own desires and ambitions and instead seek to follow Christ at all costs. This is to be seen in the way that we view church. We cannot go to church that we get served, but we go to church so that we can serve others. And in the third section, Philippians 2, 12 to 18, we saw that transformation can happen because Christ has been given all authority and because he is the one that begins the work in us by saving us and forgiving us. In return, we are to obey Christ and to work at following his teachings. And why do we seek this transformation? First, because it will help us stand out as pure in the midst of a crooked generation, showing others that Christ really does offer something different, that Christ really does make an impact in people's lives. And second, we are to be transformed because it will bring joy and purpose to those who lead in us, those who lead us in the church, and to those who have invested in us.